Welcome to the undocumented world. 100 years ago, there was a chemist who claimed to be the deadliest person in history. His two inventions led to the direct deaths of tens of millions of people, a decline in human intelligence, an increase in crime rates worldwide, and even created a large hole in the Earth's atmosphere. On the other side, there was another chemist who, almost single-handedly, won the battle to save the Earth from this chemical disaster. You may not have heard this story, but it explains why today's gasoline is divided into 95 and 98 octane. The distinction behind these numbers is a testament to that historic battle. Let's go back to 1916. Dr. Kettering was lecturing on a blackboard with a group of young men in their 20s, eyes gleaming, sitting in front of him. This was a magic school based at General Motors Dayton Laboratory, one of America's top schools for inventors. Dr. Kettering was the head of this school, and they had just invented the world's first car with an electric ignition system, the Cadillac 30. Like all modern cars, it used an electric spark to start, allowing for on-to start. Before this, cars were like tractors, requiring a hand crank to start. A few years earlier, a woman's car broke down on a bridge, and she couldn't turn the crank. A man behind her came to help, but the crank suddenly rebounded, hitting his jaw. He fainted and soon died. This man was Byron Carter, a pioneer in the American auto industry and the founder of Carter Car. Soon after, Carter's godfather, who was also the founder of Cadillac, approached Dr. Kettering, asking him to invent a car without a hand crank. Thus the Cadillac 30 was born, and it sold like hotcakes. However, the car still had a problem. Its engine was too noisy and constantly vibrating. So, Dr. Kettering announced to his magic school that anyone who could invent a simple method to quiet the engine would become the next millionaire. The young men were eager, and among them was our main antagonist, Thomas Midgley Jr., who, under Dr. Kettering's encouragement, began his experiment that would eventually devastate the Earth. Midgley soon reported to Dr. Kettering that the problem wasn't with the engine but with the fuel. The fuel burned and exploded in the cylinders, causing noise and vibration. This violent combustion was inevitable. Instead of improving the engine, it would be better to improve the fuel. For example, they found that adding 10% ethanol to gasoline significantly reduced the knocking. However, ethanol was too expensive to be a viable commercial solution. Another approach was to purify the gasoline, which was even more costly, but they discovered a new clue. They found that if the purified gasoline contained only iso-octane, there was almost no knocking. So, they set the anti-knock value of iso-octane at 100. If the purified gasoline contained only N-heptane, the knocking was very severe, so they set the anti-knock value of N-heptane at 0. This gave them a scale. 100% iso-octane was 100 on the scale, and 100% N-heptane was 0. Each point on the scale was called an octane number. Therefore, their goal was to find a cheap additive to make the octane number of gasoline close to 100. Dr. Kettering was very impressed with Midgley and told him that a golden future lay ahead. The scale Midgley used is what we now call the octane rating of gasoline. 95 and 98 are octane numbers. 95 means the knocking effect is equivalent to 95% iso-octane and 5% N-heptane, while 98 is 98% iso-octane and 2% N-heptane. Zero-grade diesel, on the other hand, has a knocking effect equivalent to 100% N-heptane. This is why high-performance cars need higher octane to run at higher speeds and are more precise, requiring better gasoline to reduce knocking and protect the engine. After Midgley's idea was approved, he began working day and night. Over the next 4 years, he tested thousands of substances and conducted tens of thousands of experiments. But, as he put it, most of the substances he tried were as ineffective as spitting into the Great Lakes. Finally, one day, he discovered element 52 tellurium, a perfect additive that was both cheap and effective. Excited, he ran home to share the news with his wife, but she kicked him out, saying, "You stink. Go take a shower." Tragically, Midgley found that the smell of tellurium couldn't be washed off. he was banished to the basement for 7 months. As the fifth year of his experiments was about to end, Midgley, despite being on the verge of being abandoned by his colleagues and wife, persisted. In December, he discovered tetraethyl lead, an additive that was not only cheap and odorless but also eliminated knocking at a concentration of just 1/1000. Was there a better solution? Midgley asked himself, then called Dr. Kettering, saying, "Can you imagine how much money we'll make? I just calculated at least 200 million US dollar, which is about 3 billion today." Midgley and Dr. Kettering patented the invention and then partnered with three major American companies, General Motors, DuPont, and Standard Oil. They formed a new company called Ethyl Corporation. To promote the product, Ethyl Corporation deliberately avoided mentioning the lead in tetraethyl lead, emphasizing instead that it was a new type of gasoline containing ethyl, similar to ethanol. At the time, the most fashionable way to prevent knocking was to add 10% ethanol to gasoline, but this was too expensive for many. Ethyl Corporation's advertisements suggested that they had developed a new type of gasoline containing ethylene, similar to ethanol, making cars quieter, more fuel-efficient, and more durable, and crucially, very cheap. In 1923, the product hit the market and quickly swept across America. However, journalists soon questioned whether Ethyl Corporation was deliberately concealing the toxicity of lead. They found that, within 2 months of the new factory's operation, dozens of workers showed signs of lead poisoning, and 5 died. One of the most shocking cases involved a worker who, in the factory, suddenly hallucinated, shouted about catching butterflies, and then jumped out of an 8th-floor window. The news shocked the public. Midgley, however, was a tough character. He immediately held a press conference where he poured tetraethyl lead on his hands and inhaled pure tetraethyl lead for a full minute, declaring it safe. The American Chemical Society even awarded tetraethyl lead the Nichols Medal, the highest scientific endorsement. Midgley reassured the public that tetraethyl lead was safe and non-toxic. However, after the press conference, Midgley spent a year recovering in Miami from that 60-second exposure. In reality, tetraethyl lead was not only toxic but also a terrifying environmental poison. Once lead enters your body, it acts like a ticking time bomb. Most of your cells never leave their place and rely on takeout to get calcium, iron, and zinc. When lead enters your body, it is mistaken for these elements undistributed throughout your cells. These cells, unaware of the danger, consume the lead, leading to cell death. While this sounds alarming, it isn't particularly dangerous if the exposure is not continuous. New cells can replace the dead ones. However, 2 types of cells are resistant to lead: nerve cells and bone cells. Bone cells mistake lead for calcium, incorporating it into the bones, which then continuously release lead into the bloodstream. Nerve cells, on the other hand, expel the lead, but the synaptic connections between nerve cells are polluted by lead, causing permanent damage. This results in irreversible intellectual impairment, especially in children, whose developing brains are particularly vulnerable. Lead poisoning causes bone pain, weakness, paralysis, and skin irritation. In the nervous system, it leads to permanent damage, causing irritability, abnormal behavior, and even hallucinations. Historical figures, such as the eccentric scholars of the Wei Jin and southern and northern dynasties, and the ancient Romans, suffered from lead poisoning due to their use of lead in alchemy and daily life. The collapse of the Roman Empire has been attributed to the extensive use of lead in pipes, baths, and utensils. Unlike historical instances of lead poisoning, which were limited to specific groups, the lead from Midgley's tetraethyl lead was released into the atmosphere through the exhaust of millions of cars, spreading globally. Lead is extremely stable and does not decompose naturally, distributing itself in the air, soil, and water and being absorbed by humans. It is a horrifying thought, but it took 22 years from the introduction of tetraethyl lead until the first atomic bomb explosion in 1945, which finally brought the savior, Clair Patterson, onto the scene. In many stories, Patterson is described as a genius chemist who worked on the atomic bomb, but he was just one of 130,000 experts involved. He was a little-known figure, working in a lab, unaware of the outside world. During the Manhattan Project, he used mass spectrometers to separate isotopes, but he didn't know that these isotopes would become the core components of the atomic bomb. After the bomb's explosion, Patterson returned to the University of Chicago, where he completed his master's degree and married a fellow lab researcher. In October 1945, the 23-year-old Patterson met his doctoral advisor, Professor Harrison Brown, who proposed a project using mass spectrometry to determine the age of the Earth by measuring the ratio of uranium and lead in zircon crystals. Patterson began his doctoral work, but he encountered a significant problem. The lead content in his samples varied wildly, suggesting contamination. He realized that the environment and laboratory equipment were contaminated with lead. Over the next 5 years, Patterson meticulously cleaned his lab and equipment, but the lead contamination persisted. Frustrated, he decided to build a new, ultra-clean lab, which was the first of its kind. Finally, in the 7th year, he accurately measured the lead content and determined the Earth's age to be 4.55 billion years. With his doctoral thesis complete, Patterson became Dr. Patterson. Instead of pursuing a comfortable academic career, Patterson focused on the lead pollution issue. He suspected that the Earth was severely polluted by lead from tetraethyl lead. He proposed a new project to measure lead levels in the deep ocean, reasoning that if the pollution was recent, the lead content in the deep sea would be different from that in the shallow sea. Despite the high cost, Professor Brown secured funding from oil companies who were unaware that Patterson was studying lead. Patterson's data showed that the lead content in the shallow sea was hundreds of times higher than in the deep sea. In 1963, he published his findings, stating that the high lead content in the environment was not natural and that the Earth was severely polluted. The next day, several men in black suits visited Patterson, offering unlimited funding if he studied something else. Patterson refused, pointing out the dangers of lead and the impact on future generations. The men left, and Patterson faced threats and the cancellation of his funding. However, the U.S. government supported him, and he continued his research in the polar regions. In 1966, the U.S. government organized a hearing, but the oil companies scheduled it when Patterson was in Antarctica. The hearing turned into a platform for Dr. Robert Kehoe, a health expert, to argue that environmental lead was natural and harmless. However, Patterson returned and fiercely debated Kehoe, who eventually stopped attending. The public believed the experts, but Patterson's persistence paid off. In 1979, Patterson published a study showing that modern human teeth had 1,000 times more lead than ancient teeth, indicating that even low concentrations of lead accumulate in the body and cause irreversible damage, especially in children. Studies linked high blood lead levels to lower IQ, behavioral problems, and increased crime rates. From 1923, when Midgley invented tetraethyl lead, to 1945, when Patterson discovered lead pollution, to 1963, when he proved the correlation, it took until 1986 for the global phase-out of leaded gasoline. Japan was the first to ban it, followed by the U.S. in 1996 and China in 2000. In 2021, Algeria, the last country to supply leaded gasoline, banned it. Over 98 years, the global lead emissions caused an estimated 170 million Americans to suffer lead poisoning, with cardiovascular diseases linked to high blood levels. Globally, nearly 100 million people may have died directly from lead pollution. Thanks to Patterson's perseverance, the world recognized the dangers of lead. However, Midgley had another invention, chlorofluorocarbon CFCs, for refrigeration. CFCs, marketed as safe and effective, were used in aerosol cans and refrigerators. In 1928, Midgley demonstrated CFCs by inhaling and blowing out candles. However, CFCs, while safe for humans, rose to the stratosphere where they were broken down by ultraviolet light, releasing chlorine atoms that destroyed ozone. The ozone layer protects the Earth from harmful UV radiation. The cycle of CFCs and ozone depletion led to the Montreal Protocol in 1987, which phased out CFCs. Today, lead pollution persists in lead-acid batteries, industrial waste, and piston engine fuels. CFCs and their substitutes are still used, and the ozone layer is slowly repairing itself. Nijlide died in 1944 at the age of 55, accidentally strangling himself with a bed lift he designed for his polio. In 2004, historian J. McNeil called Midgley the single individual responsible for the greatest harm to the atmosphere in Earth history. Thank you for listening to this story. See you next video.